Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Secretary Meade, Undersecretary Alcacer, Consul General Malpica, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, good evening and welcome to Rice University's Baker Institute for Public Policy. I would like to thank President Libre, who will be introducing tonight's distinguished speaker, as well as Rice University for helping to organize today's visit by Secretary Meade to the Rice campus and to the Baker Institute. I would also like to recognize the director of the Baker Institute's Mexico Center, Tony Payan, and his team for their work in hosting the Foreign Secretary for this inaugural lecture of the Baker Institute's Mexico Center. Just last year, we established the Mexico Center as a truly binational research forum to help forge a 21st century sustainable relationship between Mexico and the United States through policy research and educational outreach programs, working on areas of joint interest, trade, energy, education, health, and the rule of law. The Mexico Center has already started to demonstrate the potential benefit of increased effective collaboration by partnering with researchers and practitioners on both sides of our borders. Last month, the Mexico Center held its first policy conference, which analyzed the impact of NAFTA 20 years after the agreement went into effect. Secretary James A. Baker III, the three chief negotiators of the agreement, Jaime Sarapuche, Carla Hills, and Michael Wilson, among others, spoke at the conference, and the results were clear. Bilateral trade between the U.S. and Mexico has increased to approximately $500 billion a year, 4 times what it was prior to NAFTA. Just think of the enormity of that relationship. Closer economic ties have also brought increased investment flows, greater competition and efficiency, and promoted further cooperation regarding energy, the environment, health, security, education, and innovation. So as both countries look to move forward with expanded initiatives collaboration like the high-level economic dialogue and the bilateral forum for higher education, innovation, and research, to name just 2, the Baker Institute's Mexico Center can serve as a powerful voice studying past successes and future opportunities for strengthening the bilateral relationship and the collective North American community. So, we are honored to have with us this evening a very key Mexican official who is working at the heart of the U.S.-Mexico partnership. To introduce our distinguished guests, please welcome the President of Rice University, David Libre.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. Good evening and welcome to Rice University. We're pleased especially to welcome members of Houston's amazing consular corps community, as well as our friends old and new of the Baker Institute. We want to, of course, extend a special welcome to our guests from the Ministry of Foreign Relations in Mexico City, including, of course, our speaker, Secretary Meade, also the Undersecretary for North America and a great friend of Rice, I should add, Dr. Sergio Alcacer, and of course, our friend and also a great ambassador, not only of Mexico, but of Rice, the Consul General of Mexico in Houston, Dr. Luis Malpica. Tonight we have a great opportunity to hear from a representative of really one of today's most dynamic governments, that of President Enrique Peña Nieto, but also from an extraordinarily thoughtful and articulate representative of the United Mexican States on the international stage. He's brought remarkable energy to reshaping Mexico's role in international affairs. He has reportedly traveled on governmental business around the world more than any of his predecessors, and in fact has just returned from a trip to Portugal, which is one way of saying, he's on jet lag, so you have no excuse for falling asleep. Given his busy travel schedule, we are especially grateful that His Excellency José Antonio Meade Kuribreña is with us tonight to deliver the inaugural lecture for Baker Institute's Mexico Center. As Ambassador Jirigian has suggested, the Baker Institute's Mexico Center is emerging at a time of really great opportunity to impact the public policy questions that are so important for our 2 countries. The United States and Mexico have a long history of engagement, some good, some not so good. But rarely, if ever, has there been an opportunity like now for collaboration due to both a willingness of these two current administrations and the breadth and importance of the issues that we jointly face, including trade, infrastructure, and public health, to name just a few. Educated in both economics and law, otherwise known as the dismal science and the more dismal science, at the prestigious ITAM and UNAM in Mexico City, Secretary Meade later finished his formal education in economics with a doctorate from Yale. Secretary Meade has deep and broad experience in Mexican government, perhaps almost unparalleled, including in the ministries of Finance, Energy, and Foreign Relations, all of which he has led as secretary, as a member of the cabinets of both Felipe Calderón and Enrique Peña Nieto. What is particularly distinctive about his service is that Secretary Meade has served in the cabinets of governments from both the PAN and the PRI parties. As you may know, since taking office in December of 2012, the Peña Nieto government has put forward a truly ambitious and game-changing agenda, including significant structural reform in the areas of education, telecommunications, taxation, energy, elections, and labor. Beyond the reforms at home, Secretary Meade has his own robust global agenda, including a commitment to international action on climate change, to the UN's high-level debate on international migration and development, and a leadership role in the global partnership for effective development cooperation. He has forged also a distinctive identity through regular commentary on the Huffington Report, as well as other more traditional media, and is also, like much of Peña Nieto's cabinet, very active on his Twitter account, and indeed tweeted earlier about his visit to Houston. Rice is committed to playing a part in building strong relationships with Mexico and contributing to cross-border understanding and problem solving. We have faculty who study and teach Mexican literature, history, society, art, and economy. We have a broad variety of institutional relationships with Mexican universities, including research, student experience, and multilateral initiatives. We have close ties to universities in Monterrey, including both the TEC and UDEM. We have a close relationship with the Universidad de las Americas Puebla, which is fostered by our collaboration through the Puentes Consortium, which is started and still located at Rice. And we have a growing relationship with the UNAM in Mexico City, including a partnership around digital education that will provide free or very low-cost textbooks to Mexican students through Rice's open source platform, Connections. We've had the pleasure of working with Secretary Meade and the Undersecretary for North America, Sergio Alcocer, on a number of activities related to higher education collaboration among U.S. and Mexican institutions. As part of the Binational Forum on Innovation, Higher Education, and Research, Rice is partnering with colleagues at U.S. and Mexican research universities to create a new context and mechanism for enhanced research and innovation networks between our two countries. Secretary Meade and Undersecretary Alcocer have been energetic advocates of building cross-border higher education relationships. And so it is a great honor for me and a privilege to welcome Secretary José Antonio Meade to Rice University's Baker Institute to deliver the inaugural lecture at the Mexico Center. After that, he will take questions from the audience, which you may submit at any time on the cards you received on your way in. Please now join me in welcoming His Excellency José Antonio Meade Kuribreña, Foreign Minister of the United Mexican States.
Thank you, Edward, for having me. Thank you, David, for your very generous presentation. Thank you, Tony, for inviting me to participate in this inaugural address. I hope, as David said, that I don't give you any reason to fall asleep other than jet lag, in which case it would be me that fell asleep delivering the conference. I will try to be brief so as to leave space for some answers and for some questions and hopefully some answers. In terms of definition of any country's foreign policy, there are many determinants. Geography is a very clear determinant. Your policy agenda also determines your foreign policy. It's very difficult to dissociate the type of image that you want to project internationally from your policy agenda domestically. Your history, your culture, your traditions also define the type of foreign policy that you want to construct. So I wanted to structure this lecture by talking a little bit about Mexico's geography, what that means to its foreign policy, and what that means for the issues that we talk about in each of our different geographical belongings. And then I'll talk a little bit about Mexico, what it is trying to do, and what that agenda means for its foreign policy. Mexico, as all of you know, has many different belongings. We have a belonging that is not the one that you typically associate with Mexico, but Mexico is a Caribbean country. With the rest of the Caribbean, we have common African, European, and Asian roots. We share beautiful blue seas and white sands. We do carnivals, we sing, and we share all of that rich cultural heritage. We have political dialogue with the Caribbean. There are many different institutions that are home, that host this dialogue, amongst which the Association of Caribbean States and the Mexico-Caribbean Community Summit, which we hold once every 2 years. So there's a space for political dialogue with a region with which we share common roots. We trade with the Caribbean. We trade roughly $3.3 billion per year. That's not a large amount, but it is significant for some of the Caribbean countries. For example, what we trade with the Dominican Republic explains about 2% of the Dominican Republic's GDP. We are a last investor in the area, and we talk with the Caribbean about natural disasters, about how to build resilience to natural disasters, how to build capacity to deal with some of those issues. We talk with the Caribbean about trade. We talk to the Caribbean about transportation, which is a challenge to the Caribbean region. We talk to the Caribbean about how to take advantage of tourism and how to construct a policy that would allow the Caribbean to be sustainable as a region and that continues, therefore, to provide valuable resources for the countries that share the Caribbean basin. Mexico is also, of course, Central American. We're Central American by ethnicity. We're Central America by proximity. That means that we were host to the Mayan civilization, to the Olmec civilization, from Maize to Chile, all the way from Colombia to Puebla. We host what was then known as the Mesoamerican region. As with Central America, that means that we have political dialogue, and we have a lot of different institutions that are host to that political dialogue. That means that we trade, and to date we trade with Central America roughly the same amount that we trade with Spain. So the economic relationship between Mexico and Central America is an important one. And this is relevant once one takes into consideration that Central America is home to about 50 million people, which is roughly a little bit less than half of Mexico's population, and that part of Central America has been enjoying very positive growth rates. We talk with Central America about how to create mutual conditions that would generate prosperity. We talk with Central America about inclusiveness. We talk with Central America about security, because we know that we will not have a Mexico that's at peace, that's prosperous, and that's inclusive, unless we have a Central America that is at peace, that is inclusive, and that is prosperous as well. Mexico is, of course, also Latin America. If you ask Mexicans to define themselves, 80% of them will say that they are Latin American. That means that we embody a common history, we share similar cultural identities. It means that we believe that Pablo Neruda, Garcia Marquez, Mario Vargas Llosa, and Octavio Paz are not just Chilean, Colombian, Peruvian, and Mexican, but also Latin American. As well as with Central America and the Caribbean, we have political dialogue. We have more institutions that foster this political dialogue, that there are letters in the vocabulary. So there are almost any integration agency that you can imagine, on almost any topic that you can imagine, there's a space for dialogue within Latin America. Of course, our trade with Latin America is big. We trade roughly $30 billion with Latin America. We invest a lot in Latin America. We invest roughly $85 billion. And we talk with Latin America about integration, because we know that the way forward for Latin America is to present itself as an economic bloc of importance. That explains why we have put so much effort into constructing the Pacific Alliance with Chile, with Colombia, and Peru, which is the instance of economic integration that has been the most successful in Latin American recent history. We have done a lot in terms of fostering trade. We have done a lot in terms of fostering mobility of both capital and people. And we have done a lot in terms of identifying how we can cooperate together. Mexico also shares the Pacific Basin. And that part of Mexico's history has been rich throughout the centuries. One of the earliest trade routes established was precisely the trade route that went from China to the Philippines to Acapulco in the Manila galleons. So it's natural for Mexico to look at the Pacific, where there are also specific instances where we can hold political dialogue. There's the association, the Pacific Economic Cooperation Council, the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation, the Forum for East Asia Latin America Cooperation, and the Pacific Basic Economic Council. We also talk to the Asia-Pacific region about trade. We actually trade with the Asia-Pacific region $140 billion every year. They are our second largest trading partner. We are participants in the Trans-Pacific Partnership because it is close to our values that are associated with free trade. Of course, modern Mexico is born from a fusion of two countries, the indigenous countries from Mexico and the European countries, which means that Europe is a reference point for our language, for our societal norms, and for some of our political practices. We share with Europe specific dialogues for mechanism, the CELAC European Union dialogue, the Ibero-American Conference, which are held yearly, and this year will be held in Mexico. We trade with Europe more than $70 billion a year, a trade relationship that has been growing about 9% per year every year since 2000. 30% of our exports outside of the US and North America go to Europe. But of course, we are also North American. So if you kept close, if you followed the numbers closely, it will be noted very quickly how the size of the North American relationship is of a different order of magnitude with the size of the relationship that we spoke of all of these other different geographic belongings. With the US, as Edward said at the beginning, we trade more than $500 billion every year. That translates into $1.4 billion every day, which means that we trade more than $1 million every minute. For the amount of time that I have been speaking here, more than $10 million of goods have been traded between Mexico and the US. There's more than 1 million legal crossings every day. And each one of those dollars traded and each one of those legal crossings have generated shared prosperity. So what does that mean for the North American dialogue? What would we want to be able to talk about with North America and with the US specifically? We would want to be able to talk about shared and inclusive prosperity. We would want to have a dialogue that would allow us to identify new opportunities for cooperation, and we think there are plenty. The obvious ones are innovation and education. As the Dean said, we are working to foster, to build bridges so that we can have more points of integration at a higher level of education. We can talk about energy and climate change. We can talk about citizen security, migration, hemispheric, and global issues. If we just focus on the relationship between Mexico and the US, Beyond the numbers that I have shared in trade, Mexico is the first trading partner to 22 of the US states. Mexico buys more from the US than any single European country. Mexico is a larger market to the US than China and Japan combined. We buy more from the US than the UK, than Germany, than France, than Italy, and Spain put together. We buy more from the US than the sum of all the rest of Latin America combined. Mexico has become a very important export country in the world. Every dollar that we export includes 40 cents that we purchase from goods manufactured in the US. And within the US, the relationship with Texas is especially relevant. Texas is Mexico's #1 trading partner. We trade $195 billion. That means that we trade with Texas more than we trade with any single one of our other geographical belongings. Within Texas, we trade with Houston more than we trade with Canada. That means that for Mexico, the North American relationship, the relationship with Texas, the relationship with Houston, is a very relevant relationship. Beyond our geographies, what is Mexico doing, or what is Mexico that conditions the role that it plays in the world? We're the 14th largest economy in the world. We have a large population. We have a large and stable democracy. There have been stable transitions in Mexico for the last 80 years. At the rate that our economy is going, we will be the 8th largest economy by 2050. By 2050, our economy will be larger than the economy of Canada. Trade in Mexico accounts for 60% of our GDP. We're the 5th most open economy in the G20. 83% of what we export are manufactured goods. We are no longer just exporting oil. Behind Korea and Germany, we're the 3rd largest country within the G20 if you measure us as a percentage of high-tech manufacturing to GDP. Nobody exports more flat TVs than Mexico, which is very good now with the coming World Cup, where we hope that in one of those flat screen TVs, we will see a good performance of the Mexican national team. And if we don't, we will be rooting for the US because it was through your defeat of Panama that we were able to get to the World Cup. We're the 4th largest exporter of vehicles. We're the 6th largest exporter of aerospace goods. We're a country that has enjoyed macroeconomic stability for the last couple of decades, solid democratic institutions. We're a young and increasingly prepared population. We have the same demography today that the US had 40 years ago, which brings an additional element of competitiveness to the North American region. And we are working in transforming our economy. We're working to make a more competitive economy, and therefore we engage in important and meaningful labor reform, economic competition, telecommunications, financial, fiscal, and of course, energy reform. We fully believe that the energy reform that was already approved at the constitutional level will not only make energy attractive as a source, as a place where one can invest, but by having an energy sector that is more vibrant and competitive, we will make the Mexican economy more competitive. We have also approved reforms to make Mexico more transparent, and we have reformed our political and electoral authorities. We did meaningful education reform, which will prepare us and will allow us to prepare a workforce for the global world that we live in, to make pensions more universal, to introduce unemployment insurance. And we have done so by generating a democracy that actually works, by building consensus with all of the political parties represented in countries. So basically, our geography, our history and ambition, our values, and our reform agendas condition our foreign policy, and we think it's a foreign policy that will make and consolidate Mexico as a global player, but it is also a foreign policy that is committed to making North America the most competitive and dynamic region in the world, making us or moving us closer to the North American ideal that was put forth by Robert Pastor, We have, I think, we have now many of the building blocks necessary to bring that North American ideal to the future. It is fitting to give this conference here in the Baker Institute, because it was Secretary Baker, when he was foreign minister, that really was a driving force behind the North American Free Trade Agreement that has brought forth many of these visits. And what we hope at some point is that if we come back here 20 years from now, we will have the Berlin Wall in one corner and the wall separating Mexico and the US in the other one. So thank you for having me.
Thank you very much. There are some cards being passed around. They'll be the Mexico Center staff will pick them up, and then I will ask the questions. I will get them and ask the questions. I have a couple of them of my own ready, while the rest of the questions from the audience comes in. Very provocative lecture, and it really puts the relationship in a good dimension. It tells us how important the binational relationship is and how misunderstood really the relationship is in Washington, and sad to say even in Austin. Following this dialogue on the issue of Mexico's relationships, as you call them, Mexico's regional belongings, can you comment a little bit more on the Pacific Alliance and some of the key items that will be dealt with in the June meeting coming up?
The Pacific Alliance is an integration effort that brings together 4 very like-minded countries: Colombia, Peru, Chile, and Mexico. Today we are working in 3 pillars within the Pacific Alliance. We're working to identify issues that would facilitate trade. All 4 countries reached a trade agreement a couple of months ago in February. It was signed in Cartagena, that will move a trade within the next 7 to 10 years, so that 100% of the trades can move within the country at zero tariff. So all of the trade will really be free. And the trade facilitating agenda has many other issues that all 4 of us are working on. We moved so as to make it easier for people to move between our 4 countries. That meant, in the case of Mexico, taking the visa requirements away from Colombia and Peru. So basically today we are able to move freely between countries, and that has had a large impact. In just the first year since we removed the visa requirements, tourism from Peru and Colombia increased about 60%. And that tourism has been healthy, and it has not threatened the security of our region. And we have identified spaces in which we can cooperate. We had found that there's good economies of scale in promoting investments together as an alliance, promoting tourism destinations together. We have joint agencies in some countries and some cities like Istanbul, where the Pacific Alliance is promoted jointly rather than each country on its own. We have opened embassies together, such as in Ghana. The Pacific Alliance has more than 30 observers, and they go from countries like the US to countries in Central America, all the way to Portugal, Australia, New Zealand, Israel. And what we want to do in this June meeting is take advantage of the observer process, so that what they can do is choose within each pillar what specific deliverable they think would work well between the observer country and the Pacific Alliance, so we can work in incorporating that country to that deliverable. So they can identify things that we have not done yet, but it would make sense doing between the observer and the Pacific Alliance members. And so that we can identify within the Pacific Alliance what other pillars we can engage in, and how we can make the integration process work better within the pillars that we have already defined. It's a very pragmatical initiative. After every meeting, the integration process has moved further along. We want for the integration process to work also within the observers. And it is a process which has been non-ideological. It is not political dialogue. Rather, it is geared towards identifying specific measures that can bring these 4 countries more together. Panama and Costa Rica are in the process of becoming full members. So we think that it's a very interesting example from a foreign policy perspective of dialogue that actually results in concrete deliverables that improve the quality of life of the citizens of all of the countries that integrate the alliance.
Here's a very provocative question along the same lines, thinking about Mexico's foreign policy. Mexico's growing economy and increasing clout regionally in North America and elsewhere demands a higher degree of participation abroad. However, Mexico has bound itself to the Estrada Doctrine, which limits Mexico's engagement abroad. Is it time for Mexico to sit at the big boys' table, so to speak?
The Estrada regime was incorporated into Mexico's foreign policy in the 30s. And it basically states that Mexico doesn't formally recognize countries. It must be understood in a context where Mexico had to work very hard after its independence and after its revolution to gain recognition from other countries, and it decided at some point that it would not engage in the process of formally recognizing a country, a regime, or a government. Rather, it would choose to open up diplomatic relationships or not to open up diplomatic relationships, but it would not engage in specific recognition processes. Beyond that, Mexico has some constitutional principles that guide our foreign policy action, but these constitutional principles are actually reflected in the UN Charter. So it is because of the influence of that debate in Mexico, but also the influence of Latin America in the conformation of the Charter that gave birth to our principles, amongst which are non-intervention, the non-violent resolution of conflicts. Those principles, I think, have to be interpreted in a way that is in agreement with the way that those principles are interpreted today by the UN. So I don't think that there's any difficulty for Mexico to participate in the big boys table, while at the same time conforming to its own principles, which again are mirrored in the UN's charter.
Here's a couple of other questions to expand on the relationship with Central America. Can you comment on the regional cooperation agenda between Mexico and Central America, and very specifically, a question that comes from a law firm here in Houston. Is the recently announced Mexico-Guatemala gas pipeline the start of a Mexican good neighbor policy towards Central America?
What we have done with Central America is first we instituted a space for political dialogue. It is now called the Mecanismo de Tuxtla. It has its origins in 1991. The idea with that space for dialogue is that Central America and Mexico, together with Colombia and the Dominican Republic now, would get together and coordinate their policy stance abroad. It made sense for Central America, given that we share so many commonalities, to have a space where we can, in those cases where we would be in agreement, to speak with a louder voice by bringing together all of these countries. We had an ambition for integration, and we wanted to bring about policies that would make Central America, Mexico, Colombia, and the Dominican Republic better integrated. We did not have an instrument that would allow us to do so after the San Jose Accord stopped being implemented. So we created within the Mecanismo de Tuxtla an infrastructure fund in 2012. So that infrastructure fund allows us to put resources where our policy discourse was. So what we're doing is we're identifying with Central America specific projects that would result in better integration. And we are now financing and supporting highways in Honduras, in Nicaragua, in Belize, border crossings in Guatemala, a bridge between Costa Rica and Panama. All of these projects will result in building the infrastructure that we need for better integration process. Of course, we're working also in energy. Today, we're almost ready to interconnect all of the Central America electricity grid to Mexico's own electricity grid. And the next step within the energy integration process is actually to bring gas to Central America. Just to put it in perspective, generating electricity in Central America is 3 times as expensive as generating electricity in Mexico. So from a foreign policy perspective and from a development perspective, one of the most important actions that one can have is to do all that we can to provide better integration from Colombia on upwards. If you were to integrate the electricity grid of Colombia to that of Panama, that would also result in lower energy costs for Central America. And having good competitive energy in Central America would underpin the growth process that is already undergoing. So today we have a space where we can talk and coordinate policy. We have a vehicle and resources to foster integration, and we have an energy policy that is consistent to bring in conditions for Central America together with Mexico, Colombia, and the Dominican Republic to be more competitive.
Continuing on that line of energy, what are the 2 or 3 main challenges that you see Mexico is facing on implementing its coming energy reform?
Well, we need first to get the secondary legislation approved. That has already been presented into Congress. It is a proposal that is very much in line with the constitutional reform already approved. So one of the necessary conditions for the energy reform to be fully implemented is for this secondary legislation to be debated, enriched, and hopefully eventually approved by Congress, which we hope will happen in the short run. Once the legal framework is in place, we will need to implement it from an administrative perspective and from an operative perspective. We think it's a challenge that Mexico will be up to, given that we have had some practice, some experience, given that the legal framework in a way is a legal framework that Mexico used to work with historically. So we think that the secondary legislation will be approved, that it will be consistent with the constitutional amendment, and we will be able to implement it adequately from an administrative perspective and from an operative perspective as well. But those would be, I think, the main challenges going forward.
Here's a question that pertains to Mexico's economic growth. To some extent, there are recent reports that wages have been stagnant and the middle class has remained relatively stable. What are the specific agenda items on President Pena's government to grow the middle class in Mexico?
One of Mexico's most difficult challenges has been to increase its productivity and to bring better services to the middle class, to provide a better environment to combat poverty. And I think that if you look at President Peña Nieto's agenda, there are many issues that would result in better access and better growth. You have, of course, the campaign to combat poverty and hunger in Mexico. Mexico is certainly a middle-class country, but it has large and important poverty problems that are relatively well-focused. So the idea is to align public policy so that we can bring those regions of the country where poverty and sometimes violence is very well focalized, so that through better coordination and better focalization of the problems, we are able to deal with the poverty issue. But beyond the poverty issue, we need to generate better conditions for growth. The rate of growth of Mexico, the rate of growth of any economy, will depend on the structure of that economy. The more rigidities that the economy has, the lower its rate of growth will be. So President Peña Nieto's agenda has dealt with doing away with some rigidities. So now we have a more flexible labor environment. We have a better and more modern environment, more inclusive in terms of the energy sector. We have strengthened our antitrust regulation, recognizing that many of the sectors that impact in the middle class and in poverty are very concentrated, and there is not the competitiveness conditions that would guarantee lower prices and better quality. We have done education reform, which again at its core is meant to open up opportunities through better education in the long run. So if you take into consideration all of these elements, all of this transformative agenda, and you take into consideration also that Mexico has good demography, good macroeconomic policy, stable financial sector, the combination of good fundamentals and a better microeconomic structure should result in better growth rate. If you look at Mexico's performance over the last decade, Mexico has performed better than its main trading partners. It has performed better than the OECD. But given this transformation in the microstructure of Mexico, that combined with our good macro should result in better growth rate, better distribution of income, and better opportunities for the middle class.
Let me pick up on one of those points that you touched upon briefly, education. Well, first of all, explain a little bit what this education reform consists in, and also tell us what the prospects are for higher education integration between Mexico and the United States. What are the steps, the next steps after legislation, and what impact do you think that would have?
The education reform recognizes that the most important input in the education process is the quality of the teacher. You could have, and certainly would be desirable, better infrastructure, more equipment, which is also part of the effort that Mexico is engaging in, but at the core of the education process, what you need to have is better teachers. You had a mechanism in Mexico where you could only become a teacher if you underwent training in specific institutions. So there was no competition to generate better quality, better curriculum for the teachers. Today there will be competition to become a teacher, and the monopoly that these institutions had in terms of being the only ones that were generating teachers to participate in public education has now been broken. Teachers would be evaluated, which is also something that had not happened, and they will be evaluated by an institution that has constitutional autonomy. The idea of the evaluation process is to identify weaknesses, address them through better capacity, to give the teachers the opportunity to improve themselves and their quality through capacity building, but to make sure as well that the quality of the teachers that we're putting in front of the schools was adequate to generate the knowledge that was needed. The schools will also be evaluated and the results would be made public. So you created an ecosystem that has all of the correct incentives so that we put the best teachers possible in front of the children and create the most conducive environment from them learning. The advantage in the case of Mexico is that we were already dedicating the resources. If you look at what Mexico spent on public education as a percentage of GDP, we were actually above the OECD average. What was not above the OECD average was the quality of the results. So by generating an education framework that was more conducive to results, we should help prepare younger generations of Mexicans to be successful in this global environment and in the global workforce.
What about in the binational context?
One of the numbers that surprises a lot when one looks, especially at the US-Mexican relationship, is that we don't have a lot of exchanges at a higher education level. Today, there are only about 14,000 Mexicans studying in the US, and there is a very significant numbers of Americans studying in Mexico. 14,000 is a very small number. So what we would want to see by the end of the administration is to bring that number up to about 100,000. Undergraduate, graduate, and education, short-term education experiences. We would want also, because we think it's relevant, to bring the number of students that come from Mexico, from the US to Mexico, to go up to about 50,000. We think that we would gain a better understanding, that the US will get a better understanding of Mexico, and Mexico will get a better understanding of the US if we foster this possibility for each of the two countries to get an experience in both of our education processes. We are committing the necessary resources to support the Mexicans that want to experience abroad. We're working with universities, RISE amongst them, and we want to thank the Dean who has been instrumental in designing this mechanism with Mexico. But we do think that the relationship will flourish and to the benefit of both Mexico and the US if this experience of higher education is something that we talk about, that we share, and that the numbers that we reach are numbers that are more conducive to the education process, generating value and generating scale.
Anybody that studies foreign policy understands that anybody that studies foreign policy understands that there are other actors than government actors that influence foreign policy, the processes, and the results of foreign policy. Here's a couple of questions that I will combine. One is, what do you see, I guess, the role of citizen states? What is their role, that is, in foreign relations on the agenda, the binational agenda? I presume citizen states in both the United States and Mexico. And another question related to this is, what could the Mexican diaspora in the United States do to leverage its clout on immigration reform or any other aspect of the binational relationship?
On the first issue, and I think that this is especially true in the case of the US-Mexican relationship, sometimes government are the least important factors in explaining that relationship. We have said, as David said in his presentation, in terms of political dialogue, we have had good times and bad times in terms of how governments relate to each other. But in a relationship that means that we trade as much as we do, that the US invests in Mexico and Mexico in the US more and more, that we have this large number of cultural exchanges, that you have a country where Mexican root, I would say for the Houston Oilers, but that would betray the age at which I started looking at football, because the Houston Oilers are no longer playing. But you have a very rich cultural engagement, society to society engagement, and especially in the case of the US-Mexico relationship, that has gone beyond what the governments have constructed. It's true, the government can create an enabling environment, and at some point, and in some bilateral relationships, without that enabling environment, the relationship would not flourish. But in the case of the US-Mexico relationship, the exchange in all levels is so rich, so that they definitely go beyond what the governments are trying to do in terms of their foreign policy. In terms of immigration reform, which is a topic of huge importance, first I would like to highlight and recognize, and the Mexican government recognizes, that the Mexican community in the US has organized themselves, and they have, I think, done two things. First, they have provided the worth for the US economy. They have provided that they can be constructive, successful, that they can build businesses, that they can create jobs, that they can be useful participants in the US economy. Secondly, they have shown that they can become politically organized and that they can become vocal, and I think that it is through them and through their efforts that the immigration reform is in the agenda. The Mexican government wants to provide full support to those organizations, because we recognize that it is them that have been at the center, at the forefront, and that they are the most important ingredient in the immigration reform. That explains why we have been supportive of the organizations, that we have demanded for the labor rights to be respected, that we have demanded for the human rights to be respected. And we think that more and more you can see in the US a Latino vote, a Latino community that is vocal, that wants to participate, that wants to enrich the US experience, and Mexico and its government want to be supportive of that effort, respectful of the fact that it is something that has to be debated within the scope and within the institutions of the US, but also cognizant of the fact that while this debate is happening, it is our responsibility that the debate be informed, and it is our responsibility that the debate is taken in a state or in an environment where the rights are being fully respected.
Here's a question that I will dare broaden a little bit, and it has to do with the recent fiscal reform or tax reform in Mexico. The question reads, will the recent tax increases levied on mining companies in Mexico be a potential deterrent to foreign investment and energy development? And I will broaden this. There has been an increase in taxes across many different sectors in Mexico. How is Mexico, and this question you're particularly equipped to answer because you worked in the Treasury Department in Mexico as Treasury Secretary, how is Mexico reaching that policy equilibrium in tax and spending, the public policy, to figure out how to attract that foreign capital to the mining and the energy sectors, and at the same time not deter it and at the same time have enough revenue to invest in Mexico's own development?
Fiscal reform is never popular, and it is never a finished agenda. Fiscal reform requires permanent political consensus. It requires identifying best practices. It requires identifying the policies of countries that are competing for investments throughout the world. But it is a policy that has to be defined within the context of the needs of the country and of the public goods that the country has to provide. Mexico, and this is something that has been studied and where there was broad consensus, had a fiscal system that was not generating the resources that it needed to provide the public goods that were expected of the Mexican government. These public goods being in education, in security, in health, in infrastructure, all of those elements crucial to generating a high growth environment that we wanted to generate. From a fiscal perspective, one can look at the fiscal environment after the reforms and contrast it with the fiscal environments that are relevant to those trading partners that we are competing with in terms of generating an environment conducive to reforms. When a country is looking for where to invest, they want a country that has good infrastructure, good logistics, good health, good education, good security, and a competitive tax scheme. The fiscal reform in Mexico, if you compare it to the OECD, is still very competitive. There's no single element where Mexico is in the top quintile in terms of the fiscal burden. If anything, Mexico is still well below the fiscal burden that are typically faced in both emerging and developing nations. So the fiscal reform, I think, struck an adequate balance between strengthening the capacity of the state to provide these public goods without driving away investment, either national or foreign. Of course, again, it's not popular, but I think that it is something that was well recognized, that Mexico needed to strengthen its fiscal capacity, and it needed to strengthen it in such a way that it was those that had the most that were contributing more to this generation of public goods, and I think that a good balance was struck.
One final question before we finish, and I will combine a couple of concerns in these cards. Can you speak to Mexico's exploitation of natural resources development, for example, the recent tourism development announcements, the protection of the environment, and above all, Mexico's position on climate change?
Mexico is a country, and that goes back to the point of one of the issues that we talked with the Caribbean. Along with the Caribbean, Mexico is a country that is very vulnerable to climate change. Just last year, last couple of years, we had a historic drought, and we had historic downpours, sometimes at the same time. We had countries where we had no rain at all, and we had states that we had more rain than we knew what to do with. If you look at what happened last year, we had 2 hurricanes coming over from the Pacific and from the Atlantic at exactly the same time, and the amount of rainfall that resulted created huge problems for Mexico. That is going to happen to Mexico more and more, and that really goes to the point of the need for the international community to come together and to devise ways into which we can build more resilience to the disaster risks that are already there, and that we can generate strategies to reduce the policies that are not conducive to combat climate change. Mexico is the only developing country that has a law mandating us from now until 2015 to lower our footprint, our carbon footprint. So we have an agenda, a specific agenda designed to comply with that law. Mexico has been very vocal because it is one of the emerging countries that has done the most in terms of addressing the climate change issue. So we have become very vocal in that debate, and that is a relevant part of our foreign policy. And we think that the economics also make sense. It is definitely cheaper to invest in energy efficiency. It is definitely cheaper to move away from some fossil fuels and into others that have less of a carbon footprint. It is definitely cheaper to exploit energy through renewables rather than through non-renewables than it is facing the adverse effects that climate change is doing through these extreme climate events that we are seeing more and more often in our region.
There are many questions left in the deck, but we did promise 1 hour, and this is about 1 hour since we started. Thank you very much, and help me thank the Secretary. There is a reception, and I think the Secretary will stay for a little longer, so if you have questions, you can direct your questions to him directly. Thank you.